And I think it's fairly safe to say that in recent years, the credibility of the Bible has been under attack. When I was studying, when training for the ministry, you couldn't do a New Testament course at Glasgow University. Imagine. Can I study the New Testament at university going to be a minister? Because nobody was really interested. They didn't offer the course. They didn't have a lecturer who wanted to do that, and they didn't need to do it, so they didn't do it. Like never before, the Christian faith has been subjected to scrutiny. The critics and the skeptics are not very hard to find. There are some among that number, however, who are not so sure about the skepticism. There's what they call the New Atheist movement. Loads of big stars involved in that, one of whom is Ricky Gervais. But Marcus Brigstocke, the stand-up comedian, he did some research into faith, and he wrote this book, God Caller, and you'll see underneath it says, "Are you there, God?" So he was interested, at least, in finding out. And in that book, he makes a comment about a book that was written by a man called Richard Dawkins, who is an atheist. An atheist is someone who doesn't believe at all in God. And what Brigstocke says is this. Richard Dawkins says at the beginning of his book, "I would like everyone who reads this by the time they put my book down or this book down to be an atheist." And he says, "Well, I was an atheist when I started reading The God's Delusion. But by the time I finished, I was an agnostic. I was going to read it again, but I was worried that I would turn into a fundamentalist Christian." An agnostic is somebody who believes there might be something or someone there who's created the universe and created things, but that being cannot be known. So an atheist doesn't believe in God at all. An agnostic thinks, well, yeah, there's probably something there, but you can't know that. And as Christians, we believe there definitely is someone there who was a creator and can be known. The new atheist alternative is not as attractive then as it first appears. We believe that Christianity is, or at least should be, attractive, but also that it's true. And during these next few weeks, we're going to take this journey across the terrain of the entire Bible. We're going to move from Genesis to Revelation and survey that one big story that holds everything together. And essentially, as we do that, there are two questions for you to keep in mind. Number one is this: what is the big story that holds it all together? And two, can I believe it? Is it really true? And if it is true, what difference does that make to me? You heard the guy earlier saying he'd read the Bible, he'd read the stories, he'd heard the stories, and he kind of vaguely understood it, but he didn't get it. It wasn't personal for him. So, today we start in Genesis. And we begin with a new world that's just been created, and it's fantastic. Now, creation accounts are found in different places. It's not just the Bible. There are lots of different creation stories and accounts, and actually what happened was each culture tried to explain how they got there and what had happened in the beginning. Many of the stories are entirely mythological. I want to suggest that this one is not a myth. There's a world of difference between the language of myth and the language of history. In fact, I think it can be reasonably argued that what we understand as history emerges from a Jewish worldview. A fairy tale would begin once upon a time. And it goes on to share a timeless truth. You know, beauty's in the eye of the beholder and all that kind of stuff. History is not that. History is rooted in time and in place. And Genesis begins at the beginning and follows then with family trees and historical events that indicate we're in a world of history. Of course, having said that, we could spend the next 5 weeks debating, was it actually 6 days? How did it actually happen? Is there any relationship between this and evolution? Is it 24-hour periods? Blah-de-blah-de-blah-de-blah. And the reality is that Christians have different perspectives and viewpoints on all of that. You see, Genesis doesn't necessarily answer all of the questions that we put to it. But that doesn't mean that it's not true, and it doesn't mean that it's not history. It describes in simple pictorial language the profound subject of creation and human origins. And if we can be confident that Genesis is history, we can do so because where it can be tested, it proves to be reliable. Take creation itself for a minute. It describes a moment when space and time began. Interestingly, up until the 1930s, science textbooks didn't have any of that in it. Instead, what they taught was the steady state nature of the universe. The universe has always existed, it's always been the same, it's never changed, it's all wonderful. But then, in the early 1900s, scientists began to discover that that wasn't true. That actually there had potentially been a beginning of time and a beginning of the universe, that it started somewhere. And that came to be known as the Big Bang. A moment of creation in the distant past. In those days, in the 1930s and the 1940s, the atheists and the agnostics were very unhappy at this discovery, because it began to look quite a lot like creation. Robert Jastrow, who was a leading NASA scientist, died just a few years ago. He said this in an interview with Christianity magazine. Astronomers now find that they've painted themselves into a corner because they've proven by their own methods that the world began abruptly in an act of creation to which you can trace the seeds of every star, every planet, every living thing in the cosmos and on the earth. And they've found that all of this happened as a product of forces that they cannot hope to discover. That there are what I or anyone else would call supernatural forces at work is now, I think, a scientifically proven fact. Now, this is not some weird scientist that they've produced from nowhere. This is a guy who headed up NASA. And he goes on to say this: for the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountain of ignorance. He's about to conquer the highest peak, and as he pulls himself over the final rock, he's greeted by a band of theologians who've been there for centuries. I think the best way to understand Genesis is to compare the light of Genesis with a torchlight. I'm sure you guys have been camping. You need to go to the loo at night, and you need some sort of a light at night even, and you need a light to find your way. Now, you have two choices. You could go to the minibus, and you could turn it on, and you could put the headlights on, and you could illuminate everything. Or you could take your torch, and you could tippy-toe in the light of the torch, because you can't see everything with the light of a torch. I would suggest to you that if you turn on the car headlamps, you're just going to annoy people in the next tent, because it really does illuminate everything. But not only does it illuminate everything, it also casts really big shadows. So there are bits that you can't see because they're in the shadow. If you take your torch and you go out, you can shine it in front of you, or you can shine it around you, and it shows you what you need to see in order to know where you're going. So I think that Genesis is like a torch beam that's being shone back into the past. It doesn't answer every question. It doesn't resolve every issue. But it shines light on what we need to know. So what does it show us? Well, it shows us a lost world. What has gone wrong? What do I mean by that? Well, in verse 31 of chapter 1 in Genesis, it says, God saw all that he had made, and it was good. The world was good when it was created. There's goodness in nature. There's goodness in creatures. There's goodness in the physical laws. That gravity is good. Do you know? It keeps us kind of here, and we don't float away. There's goodness in all of that stuff that God created. There's goodness in people. Even the worst of people are capable of doing good things. There's goodness. So why is it that when we turn on the TV, what we see is the bad stuff, the ugly stuff, the horrible stuff, the war and the massacre and the misery? Well, the Bible, with this torch beam shone back into our origins, begins to give us an answer to that question. And it says there that Adam and Eve were in a garden. Dun, 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 dun. There they are. Adam and Eve walking in the garden. And it's a lovely garden, because it was good. There they are. They were given that garden to tend, to look after, to care for. They were expected to multiply. They were to have children who were to have children, and they were to spread out, and they were to look after the whole earth. That was the plan. It was a good plan. And in that garden, there were two trees, or two kinds, maybe two species of trees. A tree of life that would secure them everlasting life. If they ate the fruit, they would live forever. And a tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, we don't really know much about it, except that it probably wasn't an apple. But we're just guessing. We don't really know. A lot of ink has been spilled about the purpose of the tree, and if there's a clue, I suppose it's in its name. It's the knowledge of good and evil. God tells Adam and Eve that there's only one rule that they have to keep when they're in the garden, and that is don't eat the fruit from that tree. Don't do it. Because if you do, you'll die. Fairly stark warning. But by having the tree, God showed that he was not only their partner, but he was their master. There are three people we see walking in the garden. There's Adam and Eve, and there's God. But they're not all equal. Adam and Eve were made in God's image. He wasn't made in their image. So the tree of knowledge of good and evil actually serves a purpose. It demonstrates that Adam and Eve, although they were made in God's image, they're not equal to God. It's God who sets the rules. It's God who has the knowledge and the understanding that's needed to keep things right. Only God makes the laws, and to break his rule is to try to be like God, deciding that we'll choose reality and we make the rules. And then dun, 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 into the garden slides a serpent. Outside the Bible, the image of a snake or a dragon or a sea serpent is an image of a creature that is supposed to be full of wisdom, but is also sly and deceitful. They lie, and they're very often in conflict with human beings. The earliest piece of literature ever discovered is called the Epic of Gilgamesh. And it makes reference to creation, to a flood, to a character like Noah who built a big boat. But also in that story is a serpent who tempts people. Of course, that echoes lots of the themes of Genesis. So who is this character? Who is this serpent? Well, Genesis doesn't tell us. All we know is that the serpent came into the garden to tempt Adam and Eve. But elsewhere in the Bible, what we discover is that there's a bigger picture of this creature built up, and we call him Satan or Beelzebub or the great dragon. Jesus calls him the father of lies. But at this point, Adam and Eve don't know any of that. And so when he questions what God actually told them, they don't know that they should be a bit careful. And the serpent then was the first person in the Bible, or the first being in the Bible, to use the word really. Really? And his question, I suppose, is this: can God really be trusted? Did God really say that? Is that really what God meant? That's the kind of question that he's coming with. Has God really said that you shouldn't eat from any tree in the garden? Well, the answer is no, God didn't say that. But that's what the serpent does, and that's what the devil does. He begins to distort what God has actually said. And then we read of this conversation where Eve responds. She says to the serpent, we could eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but God did say you mustn't eat the fruit from the tree in the middle of the garden. You must not touch it or you will die. And the trouble with this conversation is not that God's word is being questioned, but it's being distorted. Asking questions of God's word is not a bad thing. That's how we learn. That's how we grow. That's how we begin to understand what God is saying. We need to ask questions and we need to learn. But it's the motive that's important. It's why we're asking the question that's important. If we're asking it so that we can understand, that's one thing. But if we're asking it so that we can go, well, I don't really believe that. I think it'll be okay just to do that one thing. It's like chocolate. Do you know? Well, surely one tiny wee square of chocolate. It's not going to do you any harm, is it? I mean, it's only one. I mean, I know I said I wasn't going to have any, but just one tiny wee square, that'll be okay, surely. And all of a sudden, the whole thing's gone. That's kind of how it starts. Asking the questions are not wrong. It's why you're asking them that's important. And the serpent is asking this question, and it's not for good reasons. So, the serpent then tells an outright lie. You won't die. God said you would die. He says, no, you won't. So there must be possible to touch. That's the argument. You won't die. Surely God didn't mean if you just brush against the tree, you're going to die. Surely if you just walk over and what if one of the fruit falls on you? You're not going to die. Surely God wouldn't do that to you. But that's not what God meant. What God meant was don't deliberately go and take and eat that fruit. Don't touch it. That's what God was meaning. And so it's twisted. Then the serpent explains, for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened and you'll be like God, knowing good and evil. And so they ate it. They ate it. Hopefully. There we go. They ate it. And just in case you're thinking it was all the woman's fault, not that anybody would be thinking that at all, but just in case, verse 6 makes it quite clear that Adam was right there beside her at the time. Maybe he was watching. Maybe actually he was quite sensible. Maybe what he was doing was saying, I'm just going to watch and see, and if she eats it and then goes, I'm going to say, no, thank you very much. I don't know. Maybe he was being clever, he thought. But whatever, he didn't stop her. He didn't say, that's not what God said. He went along. He ate the fruit, and actually he abrogated any responsibility that he had to be a leader. And then when they ate the fruit, they realized that they were naked. And they cut out some clothes from fig leaves. But also, they realized that they had done something they shouldn't have done, and they felt guilty, and they hid from God. That's what happens when we tell a lie, isn't it? You think, oh, shouldn't have done that. And you feel guilty. And they hid from God. This is the event that Christians have come to call the fall. It seems a really minor and insignificant thing. I mean, at the end of the day, all they did was eat a bit of fruit. But the implications and the consequences of it were forever and for everybody. Throughout our journey in these coming weeks, we're going to see that the consequences of that decision to choose their way and not God's way were catastrophic. And that leads me to today, because we live in that broken world. We also choose our way over God's way. We choose to do our own thing, and we don't do what God has said we should do. We tell lies, and lies get out of control. They start off very small, and they end up sometimes becoming huge, and you just keep going and keep going and keep going, and you get yourself deeper and deeper and deeper into a hole. The consequence of this human rebellion in chapter 3 is that their lie gets out of control, and God brings judgment, which in many ways is him confirming the decision that they made. So their relationship with creation is broken. God says bringing children into the world is now going to be painful. Working in the fields is now going to be a battle with the weeds. Creation itself is broken. Their relationship with each other will be broken, and Adam and Eve will be in a battle of the sexes that will never achieve harmony. Their relationship with God will be broken because now they've chosen to live ignoring him rather than being under his care and protection. And that's why the Bible says they have to leave the garden. Because the very thing that they must not be able to do is to reach out and eat from the tree of life and live forever. Because if there's something worse than men and women being able to choose their own rules, it's immortal men and women being able to choose their own rules. And so they must leave the garden. And that's why death came from eating from the tree of knowledge and good and evil. It wasn't instant death. It was a spiritual death. And from that, physical death followed. So Genesis then describes the beginning of a conflict, the war of the worlds that will continue down through history. But I want to finish with a moment of hope, because there is hope. A little pointer to it in verse 15 of the chapter, and it says this: I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. God says here that between the serpent and Adam and Eve, there's going to be conflict. But in the course of time, one of her offspring is going to come and crush the serpent. He'll be injured, he'll be hurt in the doing so, but he will crush the serpent and the work of the serpent. Actually, the Bible doesn't really start in Genesis. Forgive me for starting there, because it doesn't really start there. If you really want to find out where it starts, you need to go into the New Testament. In John's Gospel, chapter 1 and verse 1, it says there, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word is Jesus. And as God created this beautiful world that was good, Jesus was there with them. And as Adam and Eve rebelled in the garden, Jesus was there as well. And as God promised to send a deliverer, a servant crusher, Jesus got ready for action. History begins with Jesus. And as we discover over these next few weeks, this story is actually more about him than it is about us. Amen. I want to sing Jesus, Hope of the Nations.